we would go back first to the mark making, because everyone was very polite about your mark making and didn't ask you too much about exactly what the marks were. And we could talk around them and say they're fragments and so on, and the state of mind you're in when you're making them, the concentration and the time lapse. But in the end, how do we think about these marks? You call them marks in a very general way, but one could also call them, you know, they were called calligraphy, or with the music behind a score. At one point you put your hand and you start making the marks with your charcoaly fingers, and they almost look like sort of paw marks, like animal marks. They could be seen in the context of you know, prisons, marking time in that way. You've also drawn lines, so you know they're not totally arbitrary. They follow a linear line. Do you want to tell us a bit more about how you came up with those particular marks, and how much you planned them, and how much of a language they developed in your mind for you, and what kind of language or code they might mean or be for you?
Yeah, thank you, Jen. Gosh, that's quite a lot to do. Yeah, no, okay. I think maybe if I start at the beginning with these marks, to be really simple about it. About a week after my husband died, and he died suddenly, so it was a massive shock. I was asked to participate in an exhibition. And I was sort of all over the place and thinking, how can, you know, I can't make work. There's too much else going on. But I sat down with in the kitchen with a piece of paper and a little thin sort of pen, and I started writing to my husband, as it were. So I was marking, and as I was making the marks, I was talking to him, not in language that we understand, but in some kind of abstract language. So it was communicating with the dead in a way. And it was very personal, and it was, but on the other hand, visually the marks were quite interesting. So I filled this whole page of these marks and exhibited them. Because that's all I could do. I was determined not to make work, but this was the only thing I could do, sort of in extremis at the time. But I carried on. Then there was a sort of compulsion to just do the mark making for no particular reason, not for communicating with anybody, but just the doing. And as Pierre says, for me, the work is always about the doing, without necessarily having any goal or any predetermined objective outcome, and so on. When I made my first film, Fragment and Trace, I just felt I needed to somehow incorporate this mark making into the work. And at that stage, I think, because having originally thought of it as it was a very intense personal thing, I wanted it to become a more universal thing and nothing to do with me at all. It became, for me, about mostly marking time. But there's a spillover, because the more I started working performatively, and I've only been doing performances really since 2015-ish, so I've been, forgive the pun, feeling my way with all this doing and mark making. It always seems to be about the hands, though, and so the haptic element of the performances that I do in general spills over into the mark making performances. Hence the clawing, and I think, for example, in Palazzo Tiepolo, I kind of at one point put my head against the board, kind of almost trying to hear it, and it's about communicating with matter, which maybe goes to answering the question which I didn't answer very well in the previous questioner who asked me about landscape. It's something to do with communication. But and going back to the, as you say quite rightly, the notation, abstract notation. I suppose the thing about the lines is that they are more open than language. If I write, let's say, a poem or an essay or whatever, somehow the mark making to me is more open to possibilities for interpretation. And that's why I prefer to use such abstract marks. But also, when I'm doing them, I feel very much the marking of time. Mm-hmm. And time, in a way, is kind of infinite, and yet in the other sense, it's finite and it runs out very quickly.
I read an interesting short book recently called Time Lived Without Its Flow. Do you know that book?
No, I don't.
By Denise Riley. I don't know if any of you have read it. She devastatingly lost a child, but she wanted to write something that was sort of not sentimental, but she writes almost diary style, and she's like you, very influenced by philosophy. And she wonders what might be a kind of literature of grief. But there's a couple of points that she makes that made me think of your work, and one was about labour, like the labour of work, which seems to me very evident in your work. We see you getting tired, we see you, when you're lifting the buckets, it gets more and more tiring, or when you're almost laying on the floor, when you're mark making. And one thing she says is that people talk about the work of grief, but what about, and this is a quote from her, the shatteringly exhausting apprehension of the needed work of living. And I think that's really true, isn't it, in mourning, that actually it's not the grieving that's necessarily the issue, it's the having to continue with your life. Yes, absolutely. And I think I expect people here, unfortunately, have lost people close to them, and I think what one is never prepared for is the sheer exhaustion of it. The sheer exhaustion. I mean, I remember going to visit a friend who very kindly invited me to stay, and she thought she was doing me such, it was so kind of her to do, and it was fantastic. And I was so pleased to be asked and everything, but the sheer physical effort of getting into the car, packing the case, which normally I would do without even thinking, and I can do now without giving it a second thought. But I remember just thinking, why am I finding this such a monumental effort? And I think probably, especially, I hope, if you lose a child, because I think the awful thing, or one of the many awful things probably about losing a child, is that it's a life yet to be lived. It's a cutting off too soon. Well, she talks about it in a way that reminded me again of how you discuss loss, which is about you end up incorporating their life and continuing it. Yes. But then in doing so, she talks a lot about time and how, especially with a sudden death, it does such violence to the experienced flow of time that time stops, and you end up living in a kind of atemporality, which eventually ends up, she talks about it welling up into a large pool in the end. And she says, it turns out surprisingly not to be necessary to live inside a time that runs in a standard movement. You discover, on the contrary, that you can manage well enough inside your private non-time of pure status. And I think a lot of your work deals in a kind of different state of time, than we're used to, whether it's because we're all so busy and our lives are so full of people, and your work is often either solitary or in landscapes where there's very few, we don't see anyone else, and that seems endless, and that your time, the sense of time is very unlike anything. It's not pressured in the same way, because we don't feel that there's an arbitrary, that there's an end or a destination or a goal. Yes, absolutely. Yes, and I think any death. I mean, my sister died some years after my husband died, and she was very ill, and so it's very interesting how we had plenty of time, to be there when she was dying, and somehow the death was just, it sounds an awful thing to say, but it was kind of somehow acceptable, because there was time to deal with it and to talk to her and all the rest of it. Whereas with a sudden one, there's a massive shock, and you
you do go into this kind of parallel reality, yes. And I think perhaps any death or any fracture in one's life, it may be, you know, a breakup or a sudden loss of a job, or I don't know what, it messes with your head in terms of what is time. How do we measure time? What is time in our lives? And I'm not conscious of doing that at all, but now that you've touched on these points, I can sort of see that they're at play. Yeah.
You talk more about, and I can see you've got the book there, your relationship to, or your admiration for Simon Critchley's memory theatre, which is more about repetition in terms of time, and that's what you mostly like to talk about. And for those of you who haven't read it, he draws on Hegel's insight on memory, that rather than reducing memory to a dull recitation of the past, on the contrary, it is a dynamic process akin to transportation or endless motion, a wheel that turns, returns and turns again.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, Simon Critchley, who is Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York, which is, some of you may know, is a recreation, as it were, a reincarnation of what was the Frankfurt School in Germany before the Second World War. And Theodor Adorno and Horkheimer and a number of the members of the Frankfurt School were exiled out of Germany, obviously, and ended up in New York and founded the New School. And this is a very curious little book. I won't give you all an exegesis of it now, but it's in an absolute nutshell, in a very simplistic way, which doesn't do justice to him at all, to Critchley at all, but he talks at the beginning about the history of memory theatres and how why they were created originally as kind of methods of memory. I mean, in ancient Greek times, they were used to memorize speeches. They were as an aid to oratory. And then they reached a kind of high point during the Renaissance when certain philosophers tried to actually create physically these kind of monumental memory theatres. But what Critchley thinks is so interesting about Hegel's insight is that, because these Renaissance memory theatres were kind of static things, and memory was kind of fixed. You know, these things that you had to remember were fixed in these compartments, and that was it. And you visit these compartments, and you visit these points of memory, and that's things that you need to memorize in a very kind of static kind of way. Whereas for Critchley, the genius of Hegel's insight is precisely exactly as you said, Jen, that memory is a much more creative, and actually Hegel uses the expression perpetuum mobile, a wheel that turns and turns again, endlessly recreating itself, which of course, since Freud and the post-Freudians, we all sort of know that memory in it nowadays, we all understand that memory is a kind of construct, and that we probably we reinvent ourselves and we reinvent our memories as we develop through life.
But on a very sort of real level, when you have some big shock, you tend to have that kind of flashback memory for a while before it changes into something else, don't you?
Yeah.
I mean, that's how you experience it. It's all well to read about it, but it really does happen, that kind of cycling of memory and changing what you remember.
Yes. And I think going back to what you were saying, I think, if I can remember right, about the sort of performance of the doing. The labour, yeah, thanks, Dennis, the labour. I think in a sense it is a bit of a sort of slightly masochistic sort of penance thing, that you sort of it's the performing, it's the physical effort of realising, in a sense, Hegel's idea of it forever reinventing itself, memory. I hope that makes sense.
There's also, I mean, I think it is just important to hang on to rituals. It just gives you something that you know you're going to do for this amount of time. It fills time, and you need to fill time. Suddenly time seems, very long, and you need to fill it in some way.
Absolutely, yeah. And that goes, of course, to the keening, which people do. Especially in some cultures, keening is very important. And as you, I'm sure a lot of you know that some cultures you can actually hire mourners who will do the keening, the physical sort of working out of the emotion of grief and loss. And I think, in a sense, my performances and the sort of endless repetitions from a personal, my work is not about me at all, and it's not confessional, absolutely not. But of course, you can't take yourself out of what you do completely, because that's just a conceit. So I suppose if I was honest, I would say there probably is an element of personal keening going on in the performances still. Yeah.
I read recently, there's a new book by an author called Judith Shalansky called An Inventory of Losses. She's the one who she produced that book of Inventory of Lost Islands. It was in various bookshops for a long time. Anyway, now she's done an inventory of losses, which I think is lovely. But the question apparently she asks, I haven't read it yet, is what is more terrifying, the notion that everything comes to an end or the thought that it may not?
Yes, absolutely. That's so interesting, because that is exactly the conundrum, isn't it, with work like this?
Yeah.
Because in a sense, one certainly doesn't want it to end. So in a sense, there's a fear of it ending. So, that's what drives it forward, perhaps. Yeah.
I wondered if, like me, you're a fan of Robert McFarlane, because there's a lot of your work when you're in these landscapes where I'm thinking of the kind of path making or mark making in nature that you're performing, and all the different relationships to the land that he talks about, whether it's that we are barely aware of, historical, geological, spiritual, biological, and all the kind of invisible pathways that exist in the world that are not officially recognised, that exist either through oral history or through unofficial maps, or through little marks in the landscape. Yes. And how they often mark either what he calls ghost roads or death roads, and those kind of paths that people take, either to literally to take the coffins to on the death march to the cemetery, or as a kind of ritual following deaths, or he talks also about the song lines as well.
Yes.
Which I thought about in relation to your work.
Yeah, I mean, one is very aware, I think, because when you have the audacity, quite honestly, to tread the earth, especially when you're anywhere in the world really, perhaps especially when one's in a world when one's in another culture, like say Uzbekistan, or one is conscious of being a visitor, and being a guest, perhaps is the better word. And one is obviously very aware of all these, that there are resonances which, one's aware of. It's like that awful Rumsfeld thing of the known unknowns. One's very aware that the stuff, especially, for example, in the Ursut Plateau, which is an extraordinary part of Uzbekistan, which is completely deserted now, and you have to go off-road for a couple of days to get there. But it's there are lots of ancient trackways across. You can still see the tracks made by humans, and the old caravanserai on the old silk routes, and masses of animal tracks as well. And one's conscious of all these layers of activity and resonances, absolutely kind of there.
That's what I was going to ask you about your walking, because I know when you're talking about mark making that you're absolutely in the moment and concentrating as if everything depended on that mark. But in terms of walking, obviously you're not walking in a vacuum, you're walking in a space that has all these resonances. How do you deal with that? Has your relationship to walking changed? Does it change depending on where you are? At one point in one of the videos you've got your eyes closed. I wonder if you're trying to sort of push away all of this resonance.
Yeah. I think yes. Yes, because I think going back to, in a way, perhaps what Pierre has picked up on is that the work is incredibly prosaic. It is just about putting one foot in front of the other. And so, yeah, that's a difficult one, Jen, because in a certain sense I am in a way shutting my eyes to what's around. This sounds a bit, I don't know what really, it sounds a bit over the top, but in a certain sense, it's because the landscape is powerful in itself and it speaks so much in itself that I don't want to be some kind of intermediary with the landscape. I'm just there. The landscape does its thing. And I'm not interpreting it or trying to, I don't write about it, or I don't, I kind of let it be and let it do its thing, without me trying to sort of be awestruck by it or kind of relate to it in any way that communicates with it, because that's disturbing it, and it's putting my relation to it in the frame, as it were, and I don't want that to be in the frame.
On the other hand, you can't help but be struck by scale, as
yes.
we've talked about, and particularly at some points the landscape is so sort of overwhelming that you kind of disappear into it.
Yeah.
At other times, what you're wearing or whatever stands out in relationship to it. And I was interested in what you were saying about your relationship to comments about Goethe walking in the landscape and these sort of great men thinking in the landscape, and how you would relate to that as an artist today, as a woman artist. And I was thinking about that in relationship to the idea of the sublime, and how conventionally, traditionally, you associate that with man in the landscape. You don't see woman in the landscape experiencing the sublime.
Yeah.
You expect the scale of woman to be, more in relationship to her body and domestic beauty and all that.
Absolutely. Yes, and those great male philosophers, they were great walkers and great improvers of their minds, and wrote, Goethe wrote so much about walking. And I think I was actually, funnily enough, I was asked about what did I feel as a woman about walking compared to them or something. And I thought, well, I don't really think in those terms. But I think that the difference for me, there is a difference. And for me, the most important difference, or the most important element of what I'm doing when I'm doing these walks, is the purposelessness of them. There's no I am improving myself, or I am learning philosophy about the landscape, or I am, it's not that. Again, it goes right back to the prosaic, the one foot in front of the other, and the purposelessness of it, which I don't think Goethe would have, he would have understood, but he wouldn't have wanted to do. And those great male philosophers wouldn't want to think in those terms. Well, didn't, that's for sure.
What about your costumes, what you wear? Going back to something more prosaic. Do they help you get into character, as it were? or what is the purpose of them? You know, the hat, when you watch this image of you in the hat, I mean, I feel like we're going back in time. It seems to be both timeless, but also of a different time, of some kind of Renaissance image of a meal or something like this. And then when you're wearing the sort of long dresses that change colour, I think at different points, you know, there's a sort of kind of grand priestess or sort of ritualistic, you know, quite almost biblical aspect to them.
Yes, I mean, costume in these contexts, in this sort of context, is so difficult. And I don't think I've ever got it right, to be quite honest. I suppose with Fragment and Trace, it was all black, and I suppose for me the black, it wasn't about sort of widowhood or anything as such, because obviously black is the colour of mourning in the Western world, but I think it's red or white. I think maybe white. Anyway, other colours are the colours of mourning in other cultures. I think red is sometimes a colour of mourning. I see Fen is. I think red in China, is that right? Is it red or white?
Yeah.
White. Yeah.
I think
So
blue is as well.
blue. Yeah.
I swear, I don't know which country.
Yeah. So the black is you know, it's not meant to be, you know, I am in mourning or anything. But it's a fairly neutral colour. Also cinematically, to be practical, it's fairly striking. It's obviously especially striking against snow. The hat, the hat originally was to neutralise me, so that you didn't know it was me. Especially in Fragment and Trace, I always remember saying to Simon, "Do not film my face, because I don't want to be recognised." Obviously, anyone who knows me and knows it's me. But if it's out there and somebody who doesn't know me sees, hopefully they don't know it's me. Especially in Fragment and Trace, and to a large extent in memory theatre. In Perpetuum mobile, I was persuaded very much against my better judgment to show my face, and at the end of Perpetuum mobile, you actually see me coming out of the kind of the mist, and you end up with my face absolutely up against the screen, looking rather knackered and exhausted. And I think Simon, who persuaded me to do that, was right, because in that particular film, that particular piece. But the hat, in a certain sense, was more to disguise me, Yeah.
I wanted to ask about your relationship to art history, because you talk a lot about your relationship to philosophy, but not so much an art historical context. I know that you have an MA in aesthetics and art theory, so that would explain a lot of this. But I wondered how you see yourself in relation to, let's say, minimalism, or any of the, aesthetically, any comparisons that might be made or context that might come up for your work.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, to me it seems very different, but there is a visual language that you're using.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I mean, as you know, Jen, trying to find a visual language for these abstract concepts is really difficult. I mean, I think I think I have tended to call myself a conceptual artist, because before I started making video work and film work, which is recent in my practice, I've only been doing it since 2015, really. My work was much more to do with installations sort of work, which was but very, very slight. So, for example, if you saw an installation of mine, you'd have to actually hunt around the room to find what's going on. And I do think of my work, I do think that art is a kind of sort of not exactly social service, but I'm not interested in making more objects for the art world. There are enough of those around. I mean, this is, so in that sense, I'm speaking in the way of the conceptual artists of the 60s. You know, Lawrence Wiener spoke exactly on the, you know, I'm not the first person by a long way to think on those lines. Sol LeWitt, obviously, with his sentences on conceptual art. They are keystones for me. So in a certain sense, one would perhaps, I think of myself as a conceptual artist because the idea is the most important thing. But there's a fluxus element in the humour and the absurd. So I think that's where it kind of lies in art historical terms, if I had to think of it in those terms.
I just had one more sort of area that I wanted to ask about, and that's the music, the soundscape elements and live elements indeed in Venice by Tom Lane. And you talked of your great working relationship, but I wondered how, you know, if you could talk us through that working relationship and you know, what direction you give them, if any, or you know, who responds to whom, and how that's changed.
Yeah, well, I've known Tom since about 2015 probably. He's a young composer who did music at Oxford and then at the Royal College of Music, and then he did some postgraduate work at the Humboldt University in Berlin. And I got to know him through a mutual friend. And when I made Fragment and Trace, I approached him with great trepidation. He lives in Dublin now, and he's an award-winning composer who does a huge amount of work for experimental theatre and mainstream theatre now as well. And I, as I said, approached him with great trepidation, sort of thinking he, you know, I don't know whether he would want to work with me. And I was so thrilled when he straight away said, absolutely, you know, let's do something, let's work together. So he said, so what I do, the way I work with him is I send him a rough cut. So I do, you know, the first cut of the film or video, or first-ish, you know, roughly the outline of what it's going to be, what the visuals are, the pace, the length, which is very important for musicians, and so on. So I sent him that, and especially with Fragment and Trace, I haven't needed to subsequently because he gets it so quickly, but I said to him, I want the sound to be extremely Spartan and abstract, and it absolutely must not be pretty and lyrical and beautiful. And I keep saying that to Simon, but somehow the beauty, as Pierre noticed, does kind of creep in all the time. That's an interesting dilemma which I have all the time with my work. But so I'll say to Tom, you know, can it be sparse? Can it be this? Can it be that? And I also can't resist the classical. You know, it's there's usually some Bach going on, and I will usually send him a Bach prelude or something and say, this is the kind of mood, this is the something that I'm thinking about. And of course, I do this with great trepidation because after all, he's the composer. I know very little about music. And so I don't want to sort of tell him what to do because, you know, he's extremely creative in his own right. So, but I sort of tentatively, and he normally comes back with about 4 or 5 suggested pieces. I mean, they're like, you know, 3 minutes long or less, but he comes back with these ideas, and then obviously I listen to them and I think, well, I think that one's the best one or whatever, and then we sort of have this dialogue. And with Fragment and Trace, I felt he got it straight away, absolutely. I was astonished. I'm so delighted with, I mean, you know, you can have your own, but I was very, very touched by how he responded, and I think he responded exactly. With memory theatre, we had a lot of discussion about when I'm doing the buckets and the sea, he introduced the sound of the sea to the sound, and I was very uneasy about introducing naturalistic sounds. I wanted it to be extremely abstract. I think we sort of came to rather an uneasy compromise on that one in the end. And with Perpetuum mobile, I gave him the Bach prelude. It's always forget the number. I've written it down here. BWV 846 in C major, which I'm sure everyone knows. It's one of the most famous Bach preludes. Well, you can hear it. You can hear it in Perpetuum mobile, and I asked him to sort of use that as his starting point. And in Perpetuum mobile, all the sound is actually a transcription of that prelude, and he also sort of plays it. He plays with it with the computer, and some of it's played backwards and all that sort of thing. Way beyond me, above my head, but that's the sort of thing he does with it, and I'm very pleased. I'm thrilled with what he's done with it, I have to say. When he was doing it live, was he? Did you know what he was going to play? Was he actually improvising? Yeah. And were you actually listening to it when you were? Was it helping you make the marks? Yes. And I think, to be honest, we did that project actually in London in a space project, space theatre, Project Space in the Isle of Dogs a couple of years ago. Actually, I think the sound there was a little bit more successful because I think Tom I think with Venice we slightly I don't know. Anyway, maybe the idea is that he responds to what I'm doing in real time, and it's really difficult for him. Yes. Because he doesn't know what pace I'm going to go at, when I'm going to finish. We do have signals, and he will signal to me when to stop, because I don't know what the time. I lose track of time, of course. So he has little signals he sends to me, and I can hear that. Okay, now it's time to stop. But yeah, it's very, very difficult for him. I liked how it was at once trance-like at moments, and then also quite insistent, like it was encouraging you. Yes. And I think he spoke to me about that afterwards, because I was so knackered. Yeah. Nudging you along. Exactly, almost physically with the sound, pushing me to finish. Yeah, I was almost unconscious with exhaustion at the end of that one. So I think I've asked you enough and exhausted you, and we've got only 2 minutes left until 6 o'clock. I know we started a bit late, but if anyone didn't manage to ask a question the first time round and has something, perhaps you could let us know. Yeah, feel free to ask anything you like. Some of you, as you said, Jen, some of you who were here for the earlier screening and talk by Pierre asked some extremely good questions already, so perhaps they've been covered. Yeah. Perfect, and we can finish precisely on time. Perfect, good, sounds good to me. Well, thank you very much for coming, everybody, and for listening. Thank you again to Pierre for taking time out this afternoon to come, very much appreciated. And thank you massively to Jen as well for likewise taking time to come. Thank you for inviting me. So thank you all for coming.